Chapter 1. Each clock in the house seemed to tick with its own individual sound. In this room alone, the farmhouse kitchen, there were 4 clocks, and, through the open doorway in the downstairs hall, there were 2 more. One hung on the wall by the cellar door. The other, its casing made of polished brass, helped to brighten up the dark corner at the foot of the stairs. At least, Rob imagined that it managed to brighten things. This was an old house, a very dark house, even in daylight. It was at exactly 6:45 p.m. that the first clock stopped. It was one of the 4 in the kitchen, and Rob, head down with his homework, did not immediately miss the sound. When the second clock in the kitchen stopped, at 6:45 and 8 seconds, it might just possibly have registered in Rob's subconscious. Just a slight thinning of sound. But homework on a Friday evening was important to him. Get that done and out of the way, then the whole weekend was his. And he had found that he could always cope with normal, everyday distractions. Even the sound of his sister's voice 10 minutes earlier had failed to interrupt his studying. 6-year-old Helen pleading for one more nursery rhyme to be read to her at bedtime. And bedtime for Helen was always like part of a ritual. Mum, Dad, a rocking chair, and just one more rhyme, please, before the bedside light was turned off in the top attic bedroom. The third kitchen clock stopped at exactly 6:45 and 18 seconds. This time it did register to Rob, just slightly. Perhaps it was because the faint, familiar voices from the attic room stopped at exactly the same moment. It was still registering in Rob's mind when the 4th clock in the kitchen stopped, 3 seconds later. Rob looked up slowly from his work. Only the faint tickings of other clocks in the house could be heard. Apart from those, there were no other indoor sounds. There was the noise of the thin, high wind that persistently blew in from the bay at Dead Man's Point and across the flat, open land that surrounded the remote farmhouse. But inside the house, nothing now, only the quiet sounds from the remaining clocks. Rob listened for a moment or two. He then put down his pencil, stood up from the refectory table, and moved to the open kitchen door. "Mum," he called, but there was no answer. "Dad?" Nothing. He had begun to move along the hallway towards the stairs when the clock by the cellar door stopped. By the time he had reached the foot of the staircase, the hands of the brass clock in the dark corner had also twitched to a standstill. Rob looked up at the flight of stairs. A good antique table on the first landing, fine prints on the walls, an earthenware jar of dried flowers and pampas grass that his mother had collected last autumn. "Helen?" He decided to call her name. After all, it might be one of her jokes, one of her baby sister tricks. Again, no answer. Rob had climbed 3 steps of the first flight of stairs when he heard the other sound. He stopped and listened. It was the kind of sound that he had not heard before in the house. There was nothing too strange about it at first. It was a murmuring, a vibrant rumbling that grew slowly and steadily louder in volume. Somehow, it was like the highly amplified sound of cloth being shaken, like the sound of clothes on a washing line, flapping and straining in a strong wind. As Rob listened, the sound seemed to reach a kind of peak, like fabric that was being stretched and torn, like the shrill shriek of ripped muslin. Then silence. Rob remained standing there on the 3rd step of the first flight of stairs. "Dad?" he called yet again. "What was that noise, Dad?" the only kind of answer from the top attic room came from Helen. She was making small, hiccupy sounds, the crying sounds of a frightened child. Rob began to run up the stairs 2 steps at a time. When he reached the 3rd landing, the very top one where the ceiling sloped, he realised that every clock in the house had stopped working. The door of Helen's attic bedroom was slightly ajar. The warm glow from the bedside lamp highlighted Helen, who was sitting on the bed. She wore a nightdress, and her favourite doll, a battered teddy bear dressed in denim, was on the bed beside her. To Rob, as he moved carefully towards the door, it should have looked as friendly and as cosy as on any other family evening. But tonight, Helen had her small hands held to the sides of her face. She was moving slightly from side to side as she stared at a fixed point in space. The short, choked, sobbing cries that came from her throat were not unlike the sounds of a small, scared animal. Rob could also see, beyond the angle of the open door, the flickering of a shadow against the far wall, the shadow of something that shifted quietly and rhythmically to and fro inside the room. Rob moved cautiously into the doorway of the room. He stood there for a moment and tried to attract Helen's attention, but his sister would not, or could not, turn her head to look at him. He counted to 5, took a deep breath, then walked into the attic room. The shifting shadow upon the wall was caused by nothing more than the movement of the rocking chair, which was swinging itself slowly to a standstill. There was no one sitting in the chair. In fact, apart from Helen and Rob, there was no one else in the room at all. Rob looked around him. The large illustrated book of nursery rhymes that his mother always read to Helen was lying on the floor, as if it had been dropped suddenly. Whenever the book was being read, Rob's father would also be listening and joining in. He would sit upon the very edge of Helen's small dressing table, as if he had no intention of staying long. Yet he would always be there, his pipe and tobacco pouch set down neatly on the dressing table beside him, until the child's light was switched off. The pipe and tobacco pouch were still there now, as if forgotten. Rob turned his head to look at Helen. "Where's Mum?" he asked her. The child said nothing. She lowered her hands slowly from her face and reached out for the teddy bear. "And Dad, where's he?" Rob waited again for a reply, but Helen continued to stare ahead as if at nothing. She still rocked slowly from side to side, making a small sound in her throat as if her real child's tears were trapped inside her. Rob moved across the room and knelt down to face Helen. He looked at her, but the eyes that looked back looked past him. They stared out at nothing. And there was only the silence of the house and the high, pinched sound of the wind outside. Rob spoke to his sister quietly but urgently. "Helen," he said, "it's me, Rob. Please talk to me." A child's eyes in a child's face, and an expression that did not belong in those eyes. Then, as if Rob's words had reached her belatedly, she shifted her focus and looked at him. It was a moment or two before the expression left Helen's eyes and she began to cry. But it was a child's normal tears this time, not the disturbing animal-like whimper that was there before. Rob put his arms around her. "It's all right, Helen. It's all right now. I'm here." And he held her for a while until her crying eased a little. "So where are they?" he asked once more. "Where's Mum and Dad?" Helen looked at him for a moment, as if she had been asked a difficult question. She then appeared to remember. "Gone," she whispered quietly. "Gone? Gone where?" But Helen was looking at him in the same way again, as if he was asking yet another complicated question. "Out of the door?" Rob asked her. "Downstairs?" Helen shook her head, but Rob persisted with his questioning. Some kind of instinct warned him that he had to. "Well, where then?" Helen answered with another quiet whisper. Just went away." "Not here in the room? They couldn't have just—" And he stopped, because Helen was nodding her head. He knew her that much, knew that she never lied unnecessarily. Neither would she play tricks on him when she knew that he was being serious. Rob stood up slowly and looked around him at the room. He looked at the book on the floor, the pipe, the pouch, the rocking chair that had rocked itself still at last. There were no large cupboards in the room, not even a wardrobe. Helen's clothes were hung in a built-in unit on the landing outside. The door through which Rob had entered was the only door. The room also had only one window. This was fitted with half-length curtains which were drawn too. Rob moved across the room and snatched the curtains open. The small window was shut tight. There was also a child guard screwed to about 2/3 of the window height. Rob tested the guard. It was still fixed firmly in place. Rob looked out. There was complete darkness outside. Just darkness and the empty sound of the wind. From Rob's window, at the opposite side of the house, one could see a few scattered lights from the houses at Scar's Edge, some 5 miles away on the other side of the bay. But from this window, nothing. Rob closed the curtains again. He then turned slowly to face his sister. Still clutching her doll tightly to her, Helen looked back at him, looked at his worried face. "Just went away," she said quietly and earnestly. "Mama and Daddy, they just went away." Rob walked back across the room and knelt down by his sister once more. He looked at her steadily. "You mean that they disappeared, Helen?" And he watched her eyes carefully as he asked the question. "Disappeared? Here in this room?" There was no hint of a lie in Helen's eyes. No game, no tricks. "Yes," she said and nodded. "Just went away."